China was not always an empire. Long before the image of a unified civilization stretching across mountains, deserts, and rivers, before standardized writing systems, before bureaucrats elected through examinations, before emperors claimed to rule under heaven, there was fracture, there was uncertainty, there was decay. The Zhou dynasty, which once justified its authority through the mandate of heaven, had begun to weaken. What had once been a centralized moral order gradually dissolved into competing states. Authority no longer radiated outward from a sacred center. Instead, it fragmented. The mandate of heaven, the belief that rulers governed by moral legitimacy, was no longer feared or respected in practice. If a ruler failed morally, heaven would withdraw its blessing. That was the theory. But in reality, power was being determined not by virtue, but by military strength, strategy, and opportunism. Regional lords consolidated power. Alliances were formed and broken with ease. Oaths lost weight. Ritual obligations became formalities rather than lived discipline. This period, later known as the Spring and Autumn Era, was not simply politically unstable. It was morally unstable. Rituals that once structured society, ceremonies of mourning, respect between generations, obligations between ruler and subject, were neglected or hollowed out. The ancient rites had been designed not merely as tradition, but as moral scaffolding. When scaffolding is removed too early, structures collapse. Confucius would later look at his era and see something many ignored. The crisis was not merely geopolitical. It was civilizational. States fought each other not because they lacked weapons, but because they lacked restraint. Rulers sought dominance, not legitimacy. Ministers sought advantage, not responsibility. The language of duty slowly gave way to the language of ambition. And in 551 BCE, in the small state of Lu, a minor political entity among many, a child was born into this instability. His name was Confucius. At birth, there were no omens recorded, no prophecies, no divine announcements. He was not born into ruling power. He was not heir to wealth. He was not destined by any visible sign to change history. His father, an elderly military officer of modest rank, died when the boy was still very young. The household that remained was not powerful. It was vulnerable, raised by his mother. Confucius grew up in reduced circumstances. The family carried distant aristocratic lineage, but lineage without wealth is symbolic, not protective. The young boy learned early that prestige does not feed a household. He worked, he observed, he listened, he absorbed. Unlike princes raised in palaces, Confucius experienced society from below its center of power. He saw a hierarchy not from the perspective of command, but from the perspective of obligation. This matters, because his later philosophy would not romanticize power. It would attempt to discipline it. To understand Confucius, we must understand the psychological environment into which he was born. Imagine growing up in a world where traditions are still spoken with reverence, but no longer practiced sincerely, where rulers invoke heaven but pursue advantage, where rituals exist but lack moral substance, where hierarchy remains but virtue is thinned. Confucius did not invent the idea of ritual. He inherited it. He did not invent hierarchy. He observed it. What he perceived was erosion. Civilizations rarely announce their decline loudly. They decline quietly. They decline when respect becomes performance, when titles lose substance, when obligations become optional, when authority no longer carries moral gravity. As a young man, Confucius became deeply fascinated with the ancient past, not because he believed the past was perfect, but because he believed it contained patterns of order. He studied early Zhou ritual codes. He examined poetry collections that preserved emotional and moral tone. He immersed himself in music, believing music trained harmony not only in sound, but in spirit. To modern ears, ritual may sound superficial. To Confucius, ritual was behavioral engineering. Ritual structures emotion. Ritual channels grief. Ritual regulates celebration. Ritual defines status. Ritual disciplines ego. Without ritual, human emotion becomes volatile. Without moral education, ambition becomes predatory. The world he observed was not lacking intelligence. It was lacking formation. And slowly, a conviction formed within him. Political collapse begins long before military defeat. It begins when character erodes. He did not immediately formulate this as a system. It was not a sudden revelation. It was accumulation. Observation layered upon observation. He noticed that families where elders were not respected produced instability. He noticed that rulers who ignored ritual lost loyalty. He noticed that language itself was becoming imprecise. Titles no longer reflected conduct. One of his later concerns would be the rectification of names, the idea that words must align with reality. A ruler must behave like a ruler. A father must act like a father. A minister must fulfill the moral weight of his title. When language detaches from conduct, confusion spreads. Confucius' era was not merely a battlefield of armies. It was a battlefield of meanings. And in that environment, the young Kong Chiu made a decision that would shape his life. At 15, he later said, he set his heart upon learning. Learning was not passive consumption. It was discipline. It was imitation of worthy models. It was memorization of poetry not for entertainment, but for moral refinement. It was rehearsal of rituals not for appearance, but for internal formation. He did not seek learning to become powerful. He sought learning to become ordered. That distinction defines everything that follows. While others prepared to dominate territory, Confucius prepared to stabilize conduct. While others calculated alliances, he studied moral causality. While others sharpened weapons, he sharpened speech. He came to believe that civilization is not preserved by force alone. Force can unify territory, but only character can unify society. This idea, simple yet profound, would later challenge the dominant thinking of his time. But in this first stage of his life, he was still a student, still forming, still observing, still absorbing the silent collapse of an age. He was not yet a teacher, not yet a wanderer, not yet a symbol of civilization. He was a young man watching a world slowly lose its center, and he was preparing, though perhaps he did not yet know it, to attempt something extraordinary, to rebuild moral gravity in an age addicted to power. As Confucius grew into adulthood, his commitment to learning deepened. He was not studying for leisure. He was studying for reconstruction. The ancient texts he absorbed, poetry, historical chronicles, ritual manuals, were not relics to him. They were blueprints. He believed that within the early Zhou traditions existed a memory of stability, not perfection, but structure. The Zhou order, in its earlier phase, had balanced hierarchy with moral obligation. Rulers were expected to embody virtue. Ministers were expected to advise honestly. Fathers guided with authority tempered by responsibility. Sons responded with respect anchored in gratitude. Confucius did not imagine a world without hierarchy. He imagined a hierarchy anchored in moral reciprocity. That distinction would define his life's work. By his late 20s and early 30s, Confucius had developed a reputation for seriousness and discipline. He was known for his mastery of ritual forms, his knowledge of classical poetry, and his ability to interpret historical precedent. But what distinguished him most was not knowledge alone. It was access. Unlike many teachers of his era, Confucius did not restrict instruction to the aristocratic elite. He accepted students from varied social backgrounds, provided they demonstrated commitment. This decision cannot be overstated. Education in his time reinforced social boundaries. Birth determined opportunity. Ritual literacy signaled class. Confucius quietly challenged that structure. He is recorded as saying that he did not discriminate in teaching, that anyone willing to bring even a modest offering and commit to study would be accepted. This was not democratic equality in the modern sense, but it was a radical expansion of moral access. For Confucius, nobility was not secured by bloodline. It was cultivated through effort. The classroom he built was not merely instructional. It was formative. Students memorized poetry not to recite elegantly, but to internalize emotional refinement. They practiced ritual not for performance, but for discipline. They engaged in dialogue not to win arguments, but to clarify conduct. Confucius did not deliver systematic lectures. He responded. He questioned, he corrected, he adapted his guidance depending on the character of the student. To one student, he might encourage boldness. To another, restraint. He believed moral formation was personal, gradual, relational. It is in these years that many of the conversations later preserved in the Analects likely took place. Brief exchanges, compressed insights, observations about conduct, loyalty, sincerity, self-restraint. His teaching style was neither mystical nor abstract. It was practical. How should one act toward parents? How should one speak to a ruler? How should one behave when wronged? How should one maintain dignity without arrogance? These were not theoretical exercises. They were training for civilization. And yet, teaching alone did not satisfy him. Confucius did not intend merely to preserve culture. He intended to restore order. The world outside his classroom remained unstable. Political alliances shifted rapidly. States competed for dominance. The moral vacuum he had observed in youth persisted. At around 50 years of age, Confucius entered public office in the state of Lu. Sources suggest he held minor but meaningful positions, possibly overseeing public works, judicial matters, or administrative functions. The exact titles are debated among historians, but the broader narrative remains consistent. He participated directly in governance. For a brief period, the results appeared promising. Accounts describe improvements in order. Crime reportedly decreased. Administrative efficiency improved. Ritual observance was reinforced. Whether these reports are idealized by later followers or historically precise in every detail is debated, but the tradition consistently presents this period as a demonstration that moral governance was not merely theoretical. Confucius believed rulers must lead by example. If a ruler embodies virtue, the people will respond naturally. If a ruler corrects himself, the state aligns. He argued that punishment alone cannot produce harmony. Fear may suppress disorder temporarily, but it cannot cultivate loyalty. Moral authority, by contrast, generates voluntary alignment. But political systems are rarely transformed by idealism alone. Lu was not isolated from the broader geopolitical tensions of time. Neighboring states influenced internal politics. Court factions competed for influence. Strategic marriages and alliances shaped decisions. Confucius' growing moral authority threatened entrenched interests. Those who benefited from flexible ritual and opportunistic politics had little incentive to adopt disciplined reform. Virtue is slow to consolidate. Ambition is quick to exploit. Eventually, tensions within the court intensified. Rather than compromise his principles, Confucius left Lu. This departure marked the beginning of one of the most significant phases of his life. For approximately 14 years, he traveled from state to state with a small group of disciples. He was no longer merely a teacher. He was an itinerant moral advisor. In each court he visited, he presented the same core conviction. Political stability depends on personal virtue. Titles must correspond to conduct. Rulers must cultivate themselves before demanding obedience. Some rulers received him respectfully. Some offered temporary hospitality. Some entertained his ideas intellectually, but few implemented them. Confucius did not offer strategic military advantage. He did not promise rapid territorial expansion. He did not advocate ruthless consolidation of power. He spoke of ritual discipline, of moral self-cultivation, of governance through example. In an era increasingly shaped by realpolitik, this seemed insufficient. There are accounts suggesting moments of danger during these travels. At times, he and his disciples faced hardship, scarcity, and even threats from hostile forces. Yet, he did not abandon his position. He did not revise his message to suit prevailing appetite. He did not dilute his standards to gain influence. Instead, he refined them. He emphasized that the legitimacy of authority cannot be sustained by force alone. If rulers neglect virtue, heaven's mandate, whether interpreted literally or metaphorically, erodes. Over time, it became clear that no ruler of his era would fully adopt his reforms. This realization did not transform him into a cynic. It returned him to what he understood best: education. By his late 60s, Confucius returned to Lu once more. He did not return triumphant. He returned older. His political mission had not succeeded. He had not reshaped interstate competition. He had not unified the fractured Zhou world, but he had accomplished something quieter. He had formed disciples. He had articulated principles. He had refined a moral architecture. And in that quiet persistence, teaching rather than ruling, cultivating rather than conquering, the groundwork was laid for influence he would never personally witness. Back in Lu, no longer chasing political office, Confucius did not abandon his ambition to restore order. He refined it. If rulers would not reform themselves, perhaps future generations could be formed differently. If states resisted discipline, perhaps individuals could be shaped in such a way that discipline became natural. It is here that Confucius thought crystallizes into something more than observation. It becomes architecture. At the center of this architecture stands a concept that resists simple translation. Run, often rendered as benevolence, humaneness, or humanity. Run is not sentimental kindness. It is not softness. It is not passive goodwill. Ren is disciplined moral awareness. It is a recognition that other human beings possess intrinsic dignity, and that one's own conduct must account for that reality. Confucius rarely defined Ren directly. When asked, he answered through examples, analogies, and character traits. It is as though he believed that defining it too precisely would reduce it. Ren must be embodied, not summarized. A person of Ren does not exploit advantage at the expense of others. A person of Ren does not sacrifice integrity for convenience. A person of Ren maintains humanity even under pressure. Confucius once suggested that a person truly guided by Ren would rather suffer loss than betray moral principle. In this sense, Ren becomes the emotional core of civilization. But emotion alone cannot sustain order. Compassion without structure becomes inconsistency. This is where Li enters. Li is often translated as ritual or propriety. To modern ears, ritual can sound superficial, like etiquette without substance. For Confucius, Li was anything but superficial. Li is pattern behavior that shapes the inner life. How you greet an elder, how you speak to authority, how you mourn the dead, how you celebrate success, how you sit, stand, listen, and respond. These gestures are not empty. They discipline impulse. They regulate emotion. They signal respect. Without Li, good intentions remain unstable. Without Ren, ritual becomes mechanical. Together, Ren and Li create balance. Humanity within, order without. Confucius believed that social harmony emerges when inner disposition and outer behavior align. Yet moral life requires more than empathy and ritual. It requires judgment. This is righteousness. Is the capacity to recognize what is morally fitting in a particular situation and to act accordingly. Does not calculate reward. It does not ask, what benefits me? It asks what is right. Sometimes what is right may conflict with advantage. It may conflict with safety. It may conflict with personal desire. Demands action aligned with moral appropriateness, regardless of outcome. In this sense, Confucian ethics differs from pure consequentialism. It does not measure the value of actions solely by results, nor is it rigid legalism. It is moral discernment guided by cultivated character. Confucius believed that such discernment can only arise from training, from repeated practice of Ren and Li. Then comes Shao, filial reverence. To modern observers, this may appear restrictive or hierarchical, but within Confucius' framework, the family is not merely a biological unit. It is the primary training ground for virtue. Respect for parents cultivates humility. Obedience teaches restraint. Gratitude tempers ego. If one cannot honor those who gave life, how can one responsibly exercise authority over strangers? The family becomes a prototype of political order. Harmony within the household becomes preparation for harmony within the state. Confucius did not imagine abstract individuals floating freely from context. He imagined relational beings formed through obligation. At the apex of this moral structure stands a Junzi. Originally, Junzi referred to a nobleman by birth. Confucius transformed its meaning. Nobility was no longer inherited. It was cultivated. The Junzi is measured in speech, calm under pressure, consistent in conduct, unaffected by petty ambition. He does not seek recognition for its own sake. He seeks self-mastery. The Junzi governs himself before seeking to govern others. This redefinition was revolutionary. It subtly undermined aristocratic exclusivity. If nobility is earned rather than inherited, then moral cultivation becomes a path to authority. Confucius did not call for revolution. He redefined excellence. His system is sometimes described as conservative, but in its implications it is transformative. It shifts focus away from structural overthrow and toward personal refinement. It places responsibility not primarily on institutions, but on individuals within them. Ren humanizes, Lee structures, he judges, Shao roots, the Junzi embodies. This is not a random collection of virtues. It is a coherent system aimed at stabilizing civilization from within. Confucius did not speak extensively about the afterlife. He did not speculate in detail about metaphysics. When asked about spirits, he often redirected attention to conduct among the living. His focus remained here. How should one behave? How should authority function? How should relationships be ordered? For him, the crisis of his age was not theological. It was behavioral. Civilization does not collapse because heaven withdraws mysteriously. It collapses when virtue erodes gradually, when rulers abandon discipline, when sons abandon reverence, when language loses sincerity, when ambition displaces responsibility. Confucius believed this erosion could be reversed, not through force, but through cultivation, not through terror, but through formation, not through conquest, but through example. His faith was not in sudden transformation. It was in patient repetition. Habit becomes character. Character becomes culture. Culture becomes order. In this vision, civilization is not secured by walls. It is secured by conduct. When Confucius died in 479 BC, his ideas were not dominant. They were preserved. There is a difference. His disciples mourned him deeply. They continued teaching. They collected sayings and conversations that would later form the Analects. But China did not immediately transform. In fact, the decades after his death became even more violent. The spring and autumn period gave way to the Warring States era, a time of intensified military competition, strategic innovation, and philosophical rivalry. This was not only a battlefield of armies, it was a battlefield of ideas. Different schools proposed different solutions to the same problem. How do you create order in a fractured world? Confucians argue for moral cultivation and ritual hierarchy, but they were not alone. Legalists proposed something very different. Where Confucius emphasized virtue, legalist thinkers emphasized law. Where Confucius argued that rulers must cultivate moral authority, legalists argued that rulers must enforce obedience through strict systems of reward and punishment. Human beings, in the legalist view, were not primarily responsive to moral example. They were responsive to incentives and fear. Instead of shaping character slowly, legalism sought to control behavior immediately. Clear laws, severe penalties, centralized power. It was efficient, and in times of chaos, efficiency is attractive. The Qin state adopted legalist principles aggressively. Through military conquest and centralized administration, the Qin unified China in 221 BCE. For the first time, China became a single empire, but this unity came at a cost. Harsh punishments, forced labor, book burnings, suppression of dissent. Order was imposed, but it was brittle. The Qin dynasty collapsed rapidly after the death of its first emperor. Fear can unify territory. It cannot sustain loyalty. And here the contrast becomes crucial. Confucius had argued that legitimacy must be moral. A ruler who governs through virtue creates voluntary alignment. A ruler who governs through fear produces compliance without devotion. When the Han dynasty rose in 206 BCE, it inherited both the territory unified by the Qin and the memory of its collapse. The Han rulers faced a fundamental question. How do you preserve unity without repeating brutality? The answer was not purely legalist. nor purely Taoist. Over time, Confucian thought emerged as the dominant ideological framework of the state. Under Emperor Wu Han, Confucian learning was elevated institutionally. Classical texts associated with Confucius were canonized. Scholars trained in ritual, history, and moral philosophy gained prominence. This did not mean that legalist administrative techniques disappeared. In practice, governance often blended strict law with Confucian moral language. But symbolically and intellectually, Confucianism moved from the margins to the center. The state began to define itself not merely by control, but by cultivated virtue. Education became central to governance. Classical knowledge was no longer merely cultural memory. It became qualification. While early recruitment methods were not yet the fully developed examination system of later dynasties, Confucian scholarship formed the intellectual foundation that would shape imperial examinations in subsequent centuries. This shift is extraordinary. The man who wandered from court to court, largely ignored, became the moral vocabulary of empire. His ideas shaped political legitimacy, educational structure, family ethics, social hierarchy, language of authority. Confucius never commanded an army. He never unified states. He never saw his program adopted in full during his lifetime. Yet centuries later, rulers justified their authority through concepts he articulated. The mandate of heaven was reinterpreted through Confucian moral lenses. Officials were expected to demonstrate ritual literacy and ethical formation. The Junzi ideal became aspirational within bureaucracy. This is the great irony of his life. In immediate history, he failed. In long history, he prevailed. And yet, this victory was not revolutionary. It was institutional. Confucianism did not explode into dominance. It absorbed. It stabilized. It provided language through which power could justify itself morally. This institutionalization also changed Confucianism itself. What began as a teacher's effort to restore moral gravity gradually became embedded within state structure. The philosophy that once challenged rulers now shaped them. The school of character became the backbone of bureaucracy. And for nearly 2,000 years, Confucian thought influenced East Asian civilization, not only in China, but in Korea, Vietnam, and Japan, shaping expectations of family, education, authority, and social order. The quiet teacher from Lu had become something larger than himself. Not a prophet, not a conqueror, but a civilizational architect. More than 2,000 years have passed since Confucius walked the roads between fractured states. Empires have risen. Empires have fallen. Political systems have transformed. Technologies have reshaped human interaction beyond anything imaginable in the spring and autumn period. And yet, the questions he raised remain unsettlingly relevant. Confucius did not ask how to dominate the world. He asked how to stabilize it. He did not begin with law. He began with conduct. He did not begin with institutions. He began with character. Modern societies often prioritize autonomy, individual expression, personal freedom, self-determination. Confucius prioritized formation, relational responsibility, hierarchy structured by obligation, discipline as foundation. The tension is obvious. Is moral hierarchy a safeguard of order or a constraint upon individuality? Does discipline protect civilization or suppress potential? Confucius would likely respond that the question itself assumes a false opposition. For him, freedom without discipline decays into instability. Power without virtue becomes predatory. Authority without moral example loses legitimacy. He did not promise utopia. He offered cultivation. He believed human beings are not fixed. They are formable. Habit shapes disposition. Disposition shapes character. Character shapes culture. Culture shapes civilization. In this framework, collapse does not begin with invasion. It begins with erosion. Erosion of sincerity. Erosion of respect. Erosion of responsibility. The quiet dissolving of moral gravity. Confucius' legacy is not revolutionary spectacle. It is repetition, daily conduct, measured speech, structured behavior. In later tradition, a line often attributed to him states, The man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones. Whether authentically his or not, the sentiment reflects the spirit of his philosophy. Transformation is incremental. Civilizations are not repaired through single heroic acts. They are repaired through disciplined continuity. And perhaps this is why Confucius endures. He does not promise transcendence beyond the world. He insists on responsibility within it. He does not shift blame to fate. He redirects attention to the self. Before you reform the state, reform your conduct. Before you correct institutions, correct your speech. Before you demand virtue from others, cultivate it within yourself. Confucius failed politically, but he understood something enduring. Civilization is fragile, not because enemies are strong, but because discipline is difficult. And now, a necessary reflection. This presentation has sought to synthesize historical research, classical texts, and widely accepted scholarly interpretations. It is intended as educational exploration. Confucianism spans centuries of development. Interpretations differ. Historical records from the spring and autumn and warring states periods are incomplete, sometimes idealized, sometimes contested. The image of Confucius we inherit is shaped not only by the man himself, but by his disciples, later philosophers such as Mencius, imperial institutions, and generations of commentary. No single narrative can capture that complexity fully. This work does not claim absolute precision in every detail. It does not seek ideological endorsement or rejection. It offers a structured interpretation for study and reflection. Philosophy is not preserved through certainty. It is preserved through inquiry. Confucius did not ask his students to memorize blindly. He asked them to examine themselves. And perhaps that remains the most relevant lesson. Not obedience, not nostalgia, but cultivation. Before an empire falls, it forgets how to behave. Before society fractures, it forgets how to respect. Before power corrupts, character weakens. Confucius did not save his era, but he gave future generations a vocabulary for restoration. Whether we accept it, challenge it, reinterpret it, or reject it, the question he posed still stands. What kind of human being must exist for civilization to endure? That question belongs not to ancient China alone. It belongs to every age, including ours.